Hey friends, it's Jess with Virtually Visual. If you're new, welcome to the channel, and if you're coming back, welcome back. Today I thought it would be fun for us to do a little just easy beginner-friendly tutorial just breaking down some different render settings and things that I do to speed up my render times, and also just some other things in the render settings tab to just kind of be aware of when you are rendering your scenes. I thought it would be nice to have an actual updated comparison between frames, showing you the differences in time that you can get just by changing a few settings. So to break all this down, let's hop into Cinema 4D and take a look at our scene. Alright friends, so this is actually the sample scene that I have. I've just got this little cloner cube situation. Let's up our animation speed a bit here. I just have a random effector on some cloner with a bunch of cubes in here. And then using the user color data to affect the colors of each of the random clones. So really simple scene, really easy. And when we hit our Redshift render view, which for those of you who are new, with Redshift there is a render view option, and this is kind of just like your preview window that you can use. And you can also hit this icon to actually render an actual scene. So the preview is pretty close to the render. Sometimes there will be certain effects that won't work in the render view, but will work in the actual render option. So just be mindful of that. There are all these tools up here. Just to cover a few that I use often, we have this render region crop tool, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can choose what area you want to preview. This is especially nice if you're working with really large scenes and you need to maybe just see how a certain area looks to test. We also have this focus point option. I use this a lot to pick areas that I want to focus on, and that will change where my camera is focused depending on where I click. So just make sure to disable that once you're done, and that will only really show up if you have bokeh enabled on your camera and you've set a low aperture. So keep that in mind. Snapshots are also really nice. So if I want to kind of compare things, one thing that's nice is if I finished rendering a frame out, I can take a snapshot and it will appear down here. And if it's finished and it's an actual render and not just a preview, it will also show me details in this little area about how much time that render took, ratio, the resolution, etc. So that's pretty nice. And then this cogwheel here, if I click this, I get access to certain Redshift features like adding a LUT, which if you've not used LUTs before, LUTs are like filters. So you get all these coloring options here that you can go through. And this is nice so you don't have to pull it into any other program to kind of just add a little coloring on there. So you've also got some background and exposure stuff up here, curves, bloom, pretty self-explanatory, flare, all these things you can play around with. So this is more for post-coloring effects. But yeah, that's that. Let's actually dive into some of our settings now. If I were to just render this now as is, these are the default settings that you get with a new scene. You'll notice that things look strange and they start to get super washed out. And that is because this is Irradiance Point Cloud as the secondary render engine. You get a couple of options. Irradiance Point Cloud is the default. It is faster than Brute Force, which is the other option, but sometimes it's a little less accurate. So if you don't really care if you have very slight differences, then maybe Irradiance Point Cloud is an option for you. However, let's check that out. Usually people will go in and change that. So if we wanted to change that, when we open our render settings, should be in Redshift if you have it, and then click on Redshift. You'll be in Basic by default, but I think it's always good practice to go into the Advanced tab so you can see everything we're working with. After this renders, let's take a look. So for Irradiance Point Cloud with all of the default settings, we have 55.27 seconds. So I would say that's pretty good. That's only a minute. Let's take a snapshot so we can hang on to that. Let's delete the first one. So as you can see, we see our times here and the resolution and all that. So that's pretty fun. Before we change any resolution, because I would not render out at this size, I would probably go up to 1920 by 1080, just because I think that's a standard HD. Let's talk about some of the other settings first. So the first thing I like to go in and change usually is threshold. 0.01 is nice for getting really clean renders, and you won't have a ton of noise going on. It should be very clean. However, I don't think it's always needed because you can still get pretty clean results without that threshold being set so low. So even though it's halfway here, I think that's pretty high of a number. So I would change this. I honestly usually have mine set to 0.1, and that will look like it's almost all the way up, but don't let that freak you out. Let's just see how much that changes in our render. So as you can see, let's take another snapshot. We went from 55.21 seconds to 15 seconds. So that's a massive difference. As you also may notice, there is obviously much more grain now in the render, but you don't need to fear about that because Redshift and Cinema 4D, we have this nice option to enable denoising. So if we turn on denoising now with our adjusted threshold and we re-render, we brought our render time down. We're still at 22 seconds, so that's a little bit more than before because we've now enabled denoising. However, we do not have all that noise that we used to. Now, you may notice we do have some of these small little artifacts kind of on certain edges from the denoising. So if that really bothers you and it's a detail you want to fix, you could just take your threshold down a little bit further, maybe like 0.05 or even 0.08. That will probably help a little bit. But if we compare, it still looks pretty clean, and compared to the previous render, we got rid of all of that noise. So here was the first one with a very low threshold, and there's even a little bit of noise in there before denoising. And in our denoise option, it's very, very clean. We don't have that noise, and we've saved ourselves a lot of render time. Threshold is probably the biggest thing that will save you a ton of time, and also your render engine. So using Irradiance Point Cloud as your default render, secondary render engine, as opposed to brute force, will also really speed things up. Let's go back here though. I do also want to talk about filter. So this is set to Gaussian by default, or Gauss. I like to change this to Lanczos, or however you say this, and I like to set the filter size to 6. That's pretty high. But I watched another video where an artist talked about that is something that will add a lot of sharpness to your renders and just make it feel really tactile and just make details stand out. So I really don't know all the science behind it, but I have found that does add that edge to my render. So I really like to set this just to Lanczos and 6 for the filter size. Motion blur, there's a lot here. I will not be turning this on just because I don't have a ton of fast motion, so we won't really see much affected here by that. But you can play around with that. If you do want to have some blur, I would turn on this checkbox, deformation blur as well, keep this at 2 or 3, and then I would set your time down to maybe 30 instead of 60, and you'll start seeing some of that motion blur. If we go into globals, I'm not going to change anything in here. I like to keep all this enabled, and I want to make sure that I have ray tracing, hardware ray tracing checked if it's available. If we go to global illumination, as I said before, Irradiance Point Cloud is going to be faster than brute force, and you can get it to look similar to brute force just by changing a few things. So I've seen Ellie talk about this from Maxon. She does amazing training videos and is somebody who I used to watch all her stuff when I was getting started with Cinema 4D. And honestly, if you watch Maxon's live streams from like events, you really get a lot of really good insight from big time artists. So I'd recommend that. But she said that one thing you can do is you can up your retrace threshold a little bit to kind of help force the system to, I don't know, use more light rays in the scene, I think she was saying. So I don't know the science behind it. All I know is that for Irradiance Point Cloud, the samples per pixel is kind of determining the light source. So it's looking at every 16 pixels and then helping determine where light is coming from and kind of how to color the scene based off of that. So you could up this number to maybe 30 if you need to, but I would keep it at the 16. However, I would take our retrace threshold maybe up to 3, and that will maybe give us a little bit of a nicer result. Let's change this to brute force just so we can get a feel for the differences there in the render engine. So let's render out a scene. Okay, so if we take a snapshot of this, you can see that this time with brute force, our scene took 29.74 seconds. So again, it's a little bit longer than Irradiance Point Cloud, And to be honest, there's really not much difference. Like if you zoom in here, pay attention to the shadows here. That's kind of where you'll see most of the difference is in the shadows. So I would say it's kind of worth using a radiance point cloud. I've never seen artists really using that, and I think it's just because it's known that brute force is probably a little bit more accurate with the way light bounces off of a scene, so this might affect this scene much less than it would something else. However, I think for saving time in your renders, it might be worth to use a radiance point cloud and maybe just up your retrace threshold to 2 or 3. The only other thing that I really like to change is in the system settings. So the big one is going to be in the memory tab. By default, use GPU memory percentage is set to 90, and sometimes I experience more crashes if I don't change this. So I honestly like to set this to 60, and that saves me a lot of crashes and helps just the system run a little bit nicer for me. And I have 2 NVIDIA 3060 Ti graphics cards, so I know that my system can handle going to 256 for our bucket size. But if you don't have a beefy enough PC, then maybe keep this to the 128. This is kind of just up for experimenting, but the bucket size is just those cubes you saw in rendering, the size of that square as it renders out pieces of our image. So setting it to 256 will make this bigger, which means we have to spend less time actually going around the image to render out the parts. Covers more surface area. Let's render this one last time. Let's just check over our scene. I'm gonna lower our threshold a little bit to 0.08 just because I want to see if we can clean up a little bit of those little artifacts. Let's render that out. So as you can see, we actually have taken our render time down again, even though we've lowered the threshold. Because we switched back to a radiance point cloud, we've lowered our render time down to only 20 seconds. So as a comparison, here's what we started with, here's where we are now, almost virtually no difference. This one's actually cleaner because we're denoising, and we're cutting down our render time by 35 seconds. So that's huge. And we've optimized our settings. So I think that's just really worth noting and exploring. Really try out all of these various settings. I'll put an image here showing all these snapshots side by side. So do check that out. Pause if you need to, kind of look at the settings that you have and see if there's anything you maybe missed. It's much easier to then render out an animation knowing that you're not going to be spending 5 minutes a frame. There's one more thing I want to talk about. I had someone reach out and say that they did not know how to render out more than a single frame. Their scene, no matter what they did, they kept rendering out a single frame. And that's also in our render settings. So if you go back to your settings and go to output, by default, this is set to current frame for the frame range. So you're going to want to make sure you change that to all frames or manual, where you can set a current range here. And then let's also change our resolution, because I forgot to do that before. So I'm going to lock our ratio first, set this to 1920 by 1080, and then I'm going to change our resolution to 300 pixels per inch, or DPI. So that's kind of a resolution that I like as a base. I sometimes like to go higher. I don't often render in 16:9, so that could be part of it too. But I think these are good settings for our setup, and let's re-render this one more time. All right, so after changing our resolution, we are only at 49.26 seconds. So if you think about it, we've upped our resolution size. So we've added more pixels into our scene, and yet we still are under our first starting place for our actual render time. So I think that's pretty amazing. I've just changed a few things up just for my personal taste. So all I've done is really moved the dome light. I've rotated it a little bit here, and then I added a bevel onto my cube that's in the cloner. But I thought it would be fun to just show you quick how to get this coloring set up, because you don't need a million materials, you just need one, and you throw it onto a cloner and it will be able to scatter those colors across your clones. So if we double click into our material, we'll open the node editor, and this is how it's set up. So color user data is a node that you want to use when you have clones, and if you come over here to the presets, you go to objects and geometry ID color, that's going to take the ID for each of the for each of the clones, and it's going to assign a color to it, whatever you choose. So in my case, if I plug that into a ramp that has a bunch of colors, then it is going to assign some of those colors in this range to each of the clones randomly. So I just chose a preset. I think I chose Flame 5. I really like that one, but Cinema 4D comes with a whole bunch. So you can do that, or you can create your own and save your own presets. Using coolers.co is a great site for finding color swatches that are fun, so highly recommend that. But yeah, alright guys, that was today's video. I really hope you enjoyed just kind of getting a feel for different settings. I know some of you have messaged me about being a beginner in Cinema 4D or learning for the first time, so hopefully understanding these settings a bit better will be helpful. I hope you have a blast learning. Cinema 4D is so fun, and you can really get some beautiful results with very few clicks, to be honest. So yeah, if you want the scene file, I'm going to include that for free. It'll be linked in my Gumroad. Obviously, you'll need Redshift to download that, but yeah, you can play around with it as you would like. So thanks so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video. See ya!